Socrates stands before an Athenian jury in 399 BCE. Citizens have decided that his questions are not harmless anymore. He has not failed to understand Athens. Plato's darker thought is that Socrates has seen something too clearly, returned with it too often, and forced the city to feel what it cannot bear. Athens answers him with death. Here is the pressure behind the cave. Truth is supposed to liberate, but Plato begins with chains, shadows, a forced turning, painful eyes, and a freed prisoner who becomes less at home before he becomes more certain. The question is why Plato makes seeing clearly hurt this much. In the classroom version, the cave is a lesson about illusion. In the actual text, it is also about what clear sight costs: pain, alienation, failed return, and danger from those still facing the shadows. By the end of tonight, we will know why the cave is not just about leaving darkness. It is about whether truth still obligates us to return to the place where truth made us strangers. If you enjoy thinking through questions like this with us, subscribing helps others find them too. Sharing the video helps even more. Let's begin. You have almost certainly met Plato's cave before. It arrives early in philosophy courses because it is easy to picture: prisoners, chains, shadows, a fire, a road upward, and the sun waiting outside. It has the simplicity of a myth and the usefulness of a diagram that is part of its power. It is also part of the danger. A picture this familiar can become so easy to recognize that we stop listening to what it is actually saying. The common version gives us a clean moral geography. Down below are people trapped in illusion. Up above is truth. Education carries the lucky prisoner from one to the other. We know which side we want to be on. We know which side sounds foolish. The story becomes a way of congratulating ourselves for having heard the story. We imagine ourselves turned toward the light before Plato has forced us to feel the difficulty of turning. Let's slow the image down. The cave is not introduced as a cartoon of stupidity. The prisoners have been there since childhood, with bodies trained into one posture and eyes taught one field of vision. Their voices, honors, guesses, and memories are all organized around the shadows on the wall. From outside, we call those shadows unreal. From inside, they are the shared world, and that difference matters. A person can be wrong about the deepest structure of their world and still be intelligent within it. The prisoners can notice sequence, they can compare one shadow with another, they can compete over prediction, they can build prestige around getting the order right. Plato even imagines honors among them for the person best able to remember what usually comes before and after. Ignorance here is not emptiness, it is a whole arrangement of competence. This is why the school version misses the first wound. If the cave were only a place of obvious error, leaving it would be easy to desire. But a world that gives us language, status, recognition, and habit does not feel like a prison from within. It feels like life. We know this because we do not experience our own shared assumptions as assumptions. We experience them as the ordinary shape of things. Plato's cave becomes more unsettling when we stop using it as a weapon against other people. The phrase is tempting because it lets us say, they are watching shadows and we are not. But the dialogue does not allow that comfort. Socrates tells the story to Glaucon as an image of our condition, not merely someone else's. The cave is not a place fools live. It is the starting condition of human beings who take appearance for reality, because appearance is where life first happens. The Republic also matters. The cave is not a free-floating parable. It appears inside a long argument about justice, education, the formation of souls, and who should rule a city. Plato is not asking whether individuals can collect better opinions. He is asking how a whole person becomes capable of seeing what is real, and whether a city can survive the kind of education that turns its citizens away from comforting appearances. This is why Socrates belongs near the cave. Plato watched Athens judge the man who had spent his life disturbing its certainties. That historical shadow does not reduce the cave to biography, but it gives the image weight. Plato knew what it meant for a community to treat a questioner as a threat. He knew that returning with clearer sight could be dangerous. He did not invent that danger from nowhere. The real cave, then, is not a simple split between dark and light, but a world organized around partial light, where firelight is not nothing and shadows are not invisible. The prisoners are not blind in the ordinary sense. They see exactly what their situation allows them to see. This is why the image still works. Most human error does not feel like darkness. It feels like enough light to get through the day, so the first correction is quiet but severe. The problem is not that people in the cave lack information in the way an empty cup lacks water. The problem is that their whole field of attention has been trained in one direction. They do not need a fact inserted into them. They need a turning, and a turning is not the same thing as an explanation. Imagine being told that the skill by which you are recognized, praised, and oriented in the world is a skill at reading shadows. The claim would not arrive as liberation. It would arrive as insult, confusion, perhaps even cruelty. We can feel that before we defend against it. The world that formed us is never merely a set of claims. It is the place where our competence first meant something. This is why Plato's first image should not make us feel superior. It should make us careful. If the cave is a whole world, then leaving it is not the correction of one mistake. It is the collapse of a home. The movement upward will have to pass through loss, and the person who returns will not be returning to a neutral audience. They will be returning to a community whose reality has been challenged at the root. The familiar cave gives us a lesson about illusion. Plato's cave gives us a problem about belonging. Once we hear that difference, the whole allegory changes. The question is no longer why ignorant people resist the truth. It is why any of us would willingly let go of a world that has taught us how to see, how to speak, and how to be seen. We find another reason the familiar version becomes harmless. It turns the cave into a before and after story. Before, ignorance; after, knowledge. But Plato's image is not built around a clean line. It is built around a series of thresholds. The prisoner is first bound, then released, then turned, then dazzled, then led upward, then adjusted slowly, then sent back. Each threshold changes the meaning of the last one. If we rush to the sun, we miss the shape of the soul being changed. The cave also asks what it means for a world to feel obvious. The prisoners do not need a theory of shadows to trust the wall. They have something stronger than theory: repetition. The same field appears every day. The same names work. The same skills are rewarded. Obviousness often comes from a habit becoming invisible to itself. Plato's genius is to make the obvious visible as a condition rather than a fact. This is why the allegory should make us suspicious of easy contempt. Contempt moves too fast. It assumes that because we can name the shadow as shadow, we have escaped the structure that produced shadow thinking. But Plato's Socrates rarely lets confidence remain unexamined. The moment we use the cave to feel safe above others, we may be reproducing one of the cave's deepest habits, mistaking a position for wisdom. So the first correction has to do more than introduce the image. It has to break our ownership of it. We cannot carry the cave as a familiar teaching aid and expect it to unsettle us. We have to let the ordinary version fail. Only then does the harder version appear. Not a story about people who lack the right answer, but a story about people whose whole reality has taught them where answers come from. When the cave is heard this way, Socrates' trial is not a dramatic decoration. It becomes a warning. A city can have courts, gods, speeches, public procedures, and civic confidence, and still be unable to recognize a certain kind of sight. Plato's cave asks whether that failure belongs only to Athens, or whether it belongs to the human condition whenever a shared world mistakes its own wall for reality. Here is the reason we begin with the version we think we know. The familiar version is part of the cave's afterlife. It shows how easily a painful philosophical image can become safe through repetition. We name the prisoners, the shadows, and the sun, and then feel that we have understood the danger. But the danger was never hidden in the vocabulary. It was hidden in the cost of being turned away from the vocabulary that once made sense. A slow reading also changes how we hear the word reality. In the easy version, reality is simply outside and illusion is simply inside. Plato gives a more graduated world. Shadows, artifacts, fire, reflections, living things, stars and sun all belong to an order of more and less adequate seeing. The prisoner is not transported from nothing to everything. He is trained through degrees of dependence. That training matters because souls usually cannot jump from inherited appearance to final understanding in a single heroic leap. This is why the familiar version has to be disturbed. We are not making a famous allegory obscure for the sake of depth. We are restoring the specific discomfort that fame has worn away. The cave is famous because it is simple enough to remember. It remains philosophical because, once remembered, it refuses to stay simple. Every part of the image points beyond the diagram toward the cost of reorientation. So we begin by refusing the pleasure of already knowing. That refusal is a small rehearsal of the allegory itself. We turn away from the wall of familiar summaries and let the image become strange again. Only then can the rest of the movement do its work. The functioning cave, the painful turn, the blinding sun, the dangerous return, and the obligation that refuses to let escape be the final word. This correction also protects the question itself. If the cave is already understood, then the pain of seeing clearly becomes only a dramatic way to say learning is hard. Plato is saying more. The pain belongs to the loss of an entire orientation. We have to begin with the familiar version so that its inadequacy can be felt, not merely stated. Only then can the pain become philosophical rather than decorative. One more thing follows from this slower beginning. The cave is not an answer we possess, but a mirror held against possession itself. The moment we say we already know what the allegory means, we risk turning it into another shadow on the wall, recognizable, repeatable, and safe. Plato's image works only when it unsettles the confidence with which we use it. Now, what if the cave works? Here is the question most summaries pass too quickly. We call it a prison because we have already seen the outside. The prisoners do not have that advantage. For them, the cave contains the visible field, the social field, the spoken field, and the field of honor. It is not merely a location, it is the structure within which meaningful life has been possible. Plato tells us that the prisoners see shadows of artifacts carried behind them. They hear echoes, they name what passes by. They treat the sequence as reality because nothing in their experience has ever required a different explanation. This does not mean childish stupidity. It is what any embodied creature does when a stable environment trains its attention. We learn the world by learning what repeats. The prisoners are also not alone, and that matters. A private hallucination can sometimes be broken by other people's correction. A shared world is harder. If everyone around us attends to the same wall, hears the same echoes, rewards the same predictions, and uses the same names, the wall becomes more than a surface. It becomes public reality. We do not need certainty when we have agreement. This is why the cave is not best understood as a trap built only from false beliefs. It is built from social reinforcement. The person who predicts the shadows well is not just making a claim. They are performing competence before others, earning a kind of status, and learning how to live where they are. The cave gives them something that human beings need badly, a shared measure of success. Now we can see why leaving would not appear obviously desirable. If someone has never seen anything except shadows, they do not experience themselves as deprived of the sun. They experience themselves as located among objects they can recognize. The unknown outside is not felt as a promise. It is not felt at all. We do not long for a form of sight whose absence has never become a question. Plato's severity begins here. A person can be comfortably adapted to an incomplete reality. In fact, comfort may depend on the incompleteness remaining unchallenged. We know smaller versions of this. A workplace has its rules, a family has its silences, a society has its honored words. Within each of these, a person can become skillful without ever asking whether the whole arrangement is pointed toward what is true. The danger for us is to translate the cave into other people's errors. That move feels good and teaches little. The harder move is to notice that every shared world contains appearances we do not experience as appearances. We inherit names before we examine them. We inherit measures of value before we test them. We learn which shadows receive applause before we ask what casts them. This does not mean all social reality is false. Plato is not saying that ordinary life is worthless because it begins among appearances. He is saying that a life formed only by appearances cannot judge itself adequately from within. Here is a sharper claim. It leaves room for real skill inside the cave, while still denying that cave competence is wisdom. The word competence should trouble us. The prisoners are good at something. They may even be excellent at it. But excellence inside a bounded field can bind the soul more tightly to that field. The better we become at playing a game, the harder it can be to ask whether the game deserves our devotion. We do not merely fear being wrong, we fear losing the meaning of being right. So the cave shelters as well as deceives, giving the prisoners a place in common with objects, contests, memories, and names. If truth arrives, it will not simply replace darkness with daylight. It will interrupt all the arrangements by which the prisoners know themselves and one another. This is why the allegory has to hurt. Plato is not moving a mind from ignorance to information. He is moving a person from one world to another. This prepares the violence of the next movement. The prisoner will not ask politely to leave. Plato does not describe curiosity gradually maturing into philosophy. He describes release, compulsion, standing, turning, walking, and pain. That sounds harsh only if we forget what the cave is. If the cave is a complete world, then no purely internal desire may be strong enough to break its hold. We may dislike that thought. We should. It raises the most troubling part of Plato's education, the possibility that a soul may need to be turned before it can understand why turning was needed. That does not settle whether the turning is justified. It only shows why Plato cannot present education as a voluntary upgrade chosen by someone who already knows the value of what they do not yet see. So the cave has changed shape. It is not simply a bad place full of false pictures, it is a functioning world whose very functioning makes departure difficult. The cost of leaving is not the cost of abandoning error alone. It is the cost of abandoning a form of life that once made us competent, recognized, and at home. The cave's social world also explains why its prisoners are not waiting for rescue. Their lives contain structure. We find a before and after among the shadows. We find stronger and weaker memories. We find people who know what usually comes next. A human being can build meaning inside a narrow field if the field is stable enough. That stability is part of what makes the cave hard to leave. We should notice how much of human life depends on this kind of stability. We do not inspect every inherited term before using it. We do not test every social measure before caring about it. We enter worlds already in motion. They teach us what counts as clever, shameful, admirable, dangerous, and unserious. Long before philosophy begins, belonging has educated our attention. That early education is not always malicious. Often it is shelter. Children need a world before they can question a world. Communities need shared meanings before they can argue about them. Plato is not blind to that. The cave is frightening precisely because what shelters us can also limit us. The same wall that gives the prisoners a common field prevents them from turning around. This is why the phrase, "not a prison," should be handled carefully. The cave is still a kind of bondage. The chains are real in the image, but bondage can be experienced as normality when it has formed every available measure of normal life. The deepest chains are not always felt as restraints. Sometimes they are felt as the posture in which thinking naturally happens. Once that is clear, the pain of leaving becomes more intelligible. The prisoner does not merely lose error, he loses fluency, he loses the ease of knowing what everyone means. He loses the honor attached to ordinary competence. We often underestimate how much we fear that loss. We say we want truth, but we also want truth to preserve the forms of recognition through which we have known ourselves. Plato refuses to guarantee that preservation. The ascent may vindicate something deeper in the soul, but it will not necessarily preserve the social self formed below. The person who leaves the cave may come to see the old world more accurately, but accuracy does not restore simple belonging. That is the cost the functioning cave helps us understand. The prisoner's shared life also gives the cave its emotional force. If one person alone mistook shadows for reality, correction might be humiliating but simple. A whole community makes the correction harder because the error is distributed. It lives in customs, jokes, rankings, expectations, and ordinary language. No single person invented the cave, and no single person can easily leave its meanings behind. This is why the cave can feel protective. It narrows the field, but within that narrowness it offers coherence. Many false or partial worlds survive because they organize fear. They tell us where danger is, where honor lies, and what kind of person counts. A wider truth may be better in the deepest sense, and still feel like exposure because it removes the walls that once made danger legible. When Plato later speaks of turning the soul, this social background should still be present. A soul is not turned away from isolated propositions. It is turned away from a whole education in what to notice. This is why the process cannot be reduced to debate. Debate happens inside a field of value. Plato wants to transform the field itself. The worldliness of the cave should also make us think differently about error. Error is not always a wrong sentence floating in a mind. Sometimes it is an ecology. It has habits, rewards, fears, and shared confirmations. To leave such an ecology is to disturb more than belief. It is to disturb the conditions that made belief feel like common sense. This is why Plato's prisoner cannot simply be corrected from a distance. This is why the cave's rewards are philosophically important. Rewards teach attention. They tell the soul where to look and what to become good at. If honors attach to shadow prediction, then ambition itself becomes a chain. The prisoner may feel free while pursuing recognition that only deepens attachment to the wall. Now, what does it actually feel like to be dragged toward the thing that is supposed to save you? Plato's answer is uncomfortable from the first movement. The prisoner is released and immediately compelled, made to stand, made to turn his neck, made to walk, and made to look toward the firelight. Each step is bodily before it is intellectual. But that detail matters because Plato could have made liberation gentle. He could have written the prisoner as naturally curious, slowly rising, grateful for the chance to see more. Instead, he gives us force. The prisoner has to be moved against the direction in which his body, eyes, habits, and world have long been fixed. The first experience of education is not insight, it is resistance. This is where the Greek idea, often named periagogy, becomes important. It means a turning around, a conversion, a reorientation. In plain language, Plato thinks education is not stuffing sight into a blind soul. The soul already has a capacity for sight. The problem is direction. Education turns the whole person toward what is, and that is why the pain is not incidental. And a fact can be added without turning us. A date, a definition, a name, a technique. These may enlarge what we can say while leaving the center of our life where it was. Plato is describing something more invasive. To turn the soul is to change the direction of attention, desire, admiration, and trust. It touches the part of us that decides what counts as worth looking at. So the prisoner hurts because the body has been shaped by the cave. A neck held one way for a lifetime does not turn easily. Eyes trained on shadow do not welcome fire. A mind accustomed to one order does not immediately recognize a deeper one. We should not psychologize this too quickly. Plato makes it physical because he wants us to understand that education reaches the whole person. Think of a time when a belief changed not as a tidy correction, but as a disturbance. At first, the new understanding did not make everything clearer. It made old conversations sound strange, old loyalties harder to speak in, and a familiar landscape less readable. We were not enlightened in the sentimental sense. We were disoriented. Plato gives that disorientation philosophical form. The prisoner also sees less well at first. This is one of the most important details in the allegory. The movement toward light initially damages performance. He cannot see the objects whose shadows he once named. He is dazzled. He would rather turn back toward what he can still recognize. That impulse is not foolish, it is human. A world we can navigate badly may feel safer than a truer world we cannot yet navigate at all. Here the cave stops flattering the idea of truth. Truth is not shown as a possession that instantly empowers the person who receives it. It appears as a demand placed on a creature with habits. Those habits push back. The person being educated may feel that something is being done to them rather than for them. We can call the movement upward good only if we are willing to admit that, from the inside, it may feel like harm. Plato is careful about sequence. The prisoner does not move directly from shadows to sun. He faces firelight first, then the objects carried along the wall, then the difficult road upward, then reflections, then things themselves, then the night sky, and only last the sun. Clarity has stages, because a soul cannot bear the whole of reality at once. The pain is managed by degrees, but it is not removed. This sequence also protects the argument from a cheap reading. Plato is not saying that confusion itself is noble. The prisoner is confused because his sight is adjusting to a richer field. Confusion detached from ascent is not philosophy. Pain detached from truth is not proof. The text gives us pain inside a disciplined movement, and that distinction matters if we want to avoid turning the cave into a slogan. The person who drags the prisoner is a troubling figure. Plato does not dwell on them, but the force they represent remains. Who has the right to begin another person's turning? What knowledge would justify that intervention? What if the person being turned experiences only injury? These questions do not disappear. They will return later when Plato compels the philosopher back into the cave. The compulsion outward already contains the seed of the compulsion inward, so this is where we stand. The cave is not merely a space of ignorance. It is a world that works on its own terms, and the first act of education is not an invitation, but a forced reorientation that produces pain, resistance, and temporary blindness. The question now is more precise. What exactly is the light that hurts, and why does Plato think the soul must be turned toward it? The question has become literal. Seeing clearly hurts because the eyes are being trained for a different order of reality. But it also hurts because the person can no longer rely on the world that made them competent. The old wall is still visible, the shadows still move, and the body still remembers how to read them. Education begins by making that remembered competence unstable. The forced turn also tells us something about why argument alone may not be enough. If the prisoner's eyes are fixed on the wall, a true statement about objects behind him may simply enter the cave as another sound. It will be judged by the same posture that already misjudges everything else. Plato's education changes the posture before it can change the judgment. The result is a much more radical account of learning. We can see the discomfort in the detail of the neck. Socrates does not speak only of a mind reconsidering a proposition. He imagines a body wrenched from its trained direction. The neck is where attention becomes flesh. It marks how deeply a way of seeing has entered the person. A lifetime of looking one way cannot be undone without strain. This also explains why the prisoner initially prefers the old shadows. The desire to return is not proof that the cave is better. It is proof that the old world remains more readable. A person in transition may choose the false but legible over the true but blinding. Plato knows that the familiar can feel more merciful than the real. At this point, the teacher's role becomes morally ambiguous. The one who turns the prisoner may be helping them, but help can still be experienced as violation. We should not erase that. Plato's image gives us a beneficent violence, and beneficent violence is still dangerous. The cave forces us to ask what kind of knowledge could ever justify such an act, and how easily that claim could be abused. The answer for Plato cannot be mere confidence. The turn has to be toward what is, not toward the teacher's vanity. This is why the good will matter. Without a real measure beyond appetite, opinion, and power, the forced turning would be indefensible. With the good, Plato thinks he has a standard that can judge both the cave and the one who claims to lead someone out of it, but the standard does not remove the pain. It only explains why the pain may belong to education rather than cruelty. The prisoner does not hurt because the teacher enjoys force. He hurts because the old orientation was total. To turn a whole soul is to disturb everything that had settled around one direction of sight. We find also a rhythm of humiliation in the turn. The prisoner who was competent becomes helpless. The body that knew how to sit, look, and name must now learn like a child. Real education often contains that humiliation. We lose mastery before we gain a deeper one. We become beginners in relation to something we thought we already understood. The story is merciless about that beginner state. It does not promise that the first step toward truth will feel morally pure or psychologically uplifting. The freed prisoner is confused, resistant, and tempted by return. That matters because any serious philosophy of education has to include the learner's protest. If the account cannot make sense of resistance, it is not an account of turning. It is only an account of instruction. Plato's turn also cuts against the modern fantasy that clarity is always chosen by a sovereign self. In the cave, the self that would choose has already been shaped by the cave. Its preferences are not neutral, its comfort is not innocent. To wait for an unturned soul to desire its own turning may be to wait forever. Here is the uncomfortable logic that makes the drag necessary inside Plato's image. We find mercy in admitting this pain instead of hiding it. A teacher who pretends that turning will feel easy may make the learner feel defective when it hurts. Plato does not make that mistake. He lets the pain appear at the center of the story. The learner's resistance is not proof that the ascent is false. It is proof that the old direction had become part of the self. The pain of the turn is also the pain of dependency being revealed. The prisoner learns that what seemed immediate was mediated, what seemed natural was trained, and what seemed self-evident was arranged. Few discoveries are more humiliating. We do not merely learn that we were wrong. We learn that the conditions that made us feel right were themselves part of the problem. If the sun in Plato's cave were merely a symbol for truth, the blindness would be a dramatic flourish, a bright image, a memorable detail. But Plato places the cave after the sun analogy in Book 6, and that means the sun is doing deeper work. It is not just one more object the prisoner sees. It represents the condition that makes seeing, knowing, and judging possible. But let's say that plainly. For Plato, the good is not simply a good thing among other good things. It is what gives intelligibility to what is known and value to what is chosen. The sun in the visible world lets eyes see and lets visible things be seen. The good in the intelligible world lets the mind know and lets knowable things be known. The claim is difficult, but the core is simple enough. The good is not a fact. It is the source by which facts become truly intelligible. This matters because the freed prisoner is not merely encountering better information. He is being brought toward the source that reorders all information. A new fact can fit inside an old framework. The good judges the framework itself. This is why the light wounds before it clarifies. The prisoner is not learning that one shadow was misnamed. He is discovering that the whole basis on which shadows counted as reality was inadequate. We can feel a small analogy in ordinary life. Sometimes we learn a detail and carry on. At other times, we encounter a principle that changes what all the details mean. A hidden motive, a new standard of justice, a discovery about the conditions under which a practice works. Suddenly the old facts are not gone, but they belong to a different order. They have to be seen again from a new height. Plato's sun is harsh because the good does not simply add brightness. It exposes dependence. Everything below it, every shadow, every object, every judgment, every political arrangement, every claim about justice in the Republic is answerable to something beyond itself. Here is a heavy thought. It means the cave is not wrong only because its objects are dim. The cave is wrong because it has mistaken derivative appearances for final reality. The blindness, then, is philosophically necessary. Eyes adjusted to one order cannot immediately operate in another. A mind trained by appearances cannot instantly bear the source of intelligibility. The first encounter with a deeper principle often feels like having less certainty, not more. Plato is describing the moment when the old confidence has been broken, but the new sight has not yet become steady. This is why we should avoid flattening the sun into the word truth. Truth is part of it, but the good is stranger. The good is connected to why truth is worth having, why knowledge is ordered, and why rule without that ordering becomes dangerous. If the cave loses the good, it becomes a story about being fooled. With the good, it becomes a story about what gives reality its measure. The danger is that this can sound too abstract, so bring it back to the prisoner. He has lived among shadows and learnt their grammar. Now he is brought toward the thing by which all lesser seeing must be judged. Of course he cannot look at it directly at first. Of course his eyes ache. Of course he wants to retreat to the familiar wall. Plato's metaphysics is not floating above the story. It explains why the story hurts. The gradual ascent is also merciful in its own severe way. First shadows outside the cave, then reflections in water, then objects themselves. Then the stars at night, only later the sun. The soul requires intermediaries. It needs training. We should notice how unlike this is from the fantasy of instant awakening. Plato's education is long, disciplined, and difficult because the object is not a slogan but a source. This gives the pain a second meaning. Seeing clearly is painful not only because light is bright. It is painful because genuine clarity requires our standards to be judged. We may discover that what we called courage was imitation. What we called success was shadow competition. What we called wisdom was memory of patterns on a wall. The good does not merely illuminate objects, it changes the scale by which objects matter. That scale is why the cave belongs to a political argument. Plato wants rulers who have seen the good because, in his view, without that sight they cannot order a city justly. We do not have to accept his politics to see the logic. If governing depends on knowing what is truly good, then anyone who governs by shadows, appetites, popularity or honor is still inside the cave, even if they are very skilled there. But there is a cost in making the good so central. The higher the object of sight, the greater the alienation from ordinary seeing. The prisoner who reaches the sun cannot simply return with a new opinion to share. He carries a transformed measure. What counted before may no longer count, and what mattered before may now seem painfully small. The cave below has not changed, but his relation to it has. So the blindness reveals the structure of the whole allegory. The first light hurts because it is not merely brighter, it belongs to another order. The person moving toward it is not becoming more efficient at the old world. They are being prepared to judge the old world from beyond itself. This is why the next wound is not in the eyes alone. The wound is in memory, belonging, and the grief of looking back. The good is difficult, partly because it is not one item in the inventory of the world. We can picture the sun, but Plato's philosophical claim points beyond the picture. The good is what makes intelligible things intelligible. That means it is not reached by adding one more object to the list. It is reached by grasping the condition under which the list can be understood at all. This is why the language of brightness is both useful and dangerous. Brightness helps us imagine dependence. The visible world depends on the sun, but if we stop with brightness, we turn the good into a large lamp. Plato means something more exacting. The good is connected to truth, knowledge, being, and value. It tells the mind not only what can be known, but why knowing matters. The cave without the good can still be a compelling image, but it becomes thinner. It tells us that some people confuse images with originals. With the good in view, the cave becomes an image of ordered reality. Shadows, artifacts, firelight, reflections, living things, stars, sun. Each level teaches the soul to distinguish derivative from source. The pain comes from being moved along that order before the soul can bear it. This gives Plato's account of clarity a strange humility. The freed prisoner does not possess the sun, he adjusts to it and learns to see by it. The highest object is not something he can dominate. That matters because superiority is one of the temptations of cave imagery. Plato's own structure, if read well, humbles the knower. The good is not a trophy for the enlightened. It is the measure before which even the philosopher stands exposed. Lawfully, the exposure can be painful because it judges the soul's loves. A person may discover not only that a belief was false, but that the pattern of desire beneath the belief was misdirected. What we admired, competed for, defended and feared may all be placed under a harsher light. That kind of discovery feels less like learning and more like being seen. So the sun is not a detour into metaphysics. It is the explanation for why the cave is more than a media metaphor or a generic illusion story. Plato's light hurts because it belongs to the source of intelligibility and value. A soul that reaches toward it is not adding brightness to the old world. It is being measured by something the old world could not provide. The good also explains why the cave is placed where it is in the Republic. Plato has already been asking what justice is and why the just life is worth choosing. The cave is not an ornamental myth added to that argument. It is a way of showing what kind of soul could grasp justice beyond convention, appetite, and reputation. Without the good, justice remains vulnerable to the cave's measures. This is why the prisoner must adjust slowly even after leaving the cave. The good is too much for an untrained gaze, not because Plato wants mystery for its own sake, but because the highest principle cannot be grasped by a soul still formed by lower objects. Training is an ethical condition of seeing. What we are able to know depends partly on what we have become able to love. That thought should make us cautious about our own claims to clarity. Plato's image does not only challenge the prisoners, it challenges anyone who thinks they can speak of the sun too easily. The good is not available as a slogan. If a person invokes it without discipline, humility and return, they may only be carrying a brighter shadow. This also means that the good is not optional for the emotional argument. Without it, the prisoner's suffering can look excessive. Why should a better view hurt this much? With the good in place, the answer has sharper force. The prisoner is not adjusting to one new object, but to the source by which objects, claims and lives receive measure. The pain is proportional to the depth of the reordering. The good also prevents the pain from becoming merely psychological. The pain of clarity is not only the discomfort of changing opinions, it is the encounter with a measure that exceeds preference. Plato thinks there is something to which the soul is accountable, whether or not the cave recognizes it. That accountability is what makes the light severe. Now, what does the cave look like from outside, once someone has seen the sun? Plato does not let the freed prisoner simply celebrate. He remembers. He thinks of the first dwelling place, the wisdom honored there, and the people still chained in front of the wall. That memory is crucial. The person outside is not a creature born in daylight. He is someone who came from below. But this means the ascent produces a strange double vision. The freed person can now see the cave as a cave, but he also remembers what it was like not to see it that way. He knows the old honors from inside. He knows why the shadow games felt serious. He knows the warmth of shared recognition and the pressure of shared fear. His pity, if it is honest, is not contempt, it is memory transformed by distance, and the easy version of enlightenment often imagines superiority. Someone escapes, looks back, and feels above the others. Plato gives us something more painful. The freed prisoner has lost the capacity to belong innocently to the world that made him. He cannot unsee the shadows as shadows. He cannot pretend the honors are what they claim to be. The cave remains emotionally close and intellectually broken. So we know smaller forms of this alienation. A family story begins to look different once we understand what was left unsaid. A profession we admired begins to reveal the incentives beneath its language. A political slogan that once felt natural starts to sound like a tool. Nothing visible has changed. The room is the same, the people are the same, but our participation has changed, and that can be lonely. Plato's prisoner is not lonely because he has become clever. He is lonely because the common world has split. The people below still inhabit one order of meaning. The person above has crossed into another. Communication between those orders is not impossible, but it is unstable. Words that mean one thing in the cave may mean another in the light. What sounds obvious above can sound mad below. Here is the first social cost of seeing clearly. Truth does not only correct a mind, it can separate a person from the conditions of easy mutual recognition. We often want knowledge to connect us. Plato knows it can disconnect. To see differently is to belong differently, and sometimes to belong nowhere for a time. The cave behind us is no longer home. The world above is not yet natural. The freed prisoner's memory also prevents a cruel reading of the allegory. If he remembers his old condition, he cannot reduce the prisoners to idiots. They are what he was. Their resistance belongs to a condition he shared. That matters because philosophy becomes monstrous when it forgets its own past in the cave. A person who has no memory of needing to be turned will be tempted to treat others as obstacles rather than as souls. At the same time, memory does not restore innocence. The freed person cannot honestly re-enter the old contests, as if they still mattered in the same way. Plato asks whether he would care for the honours once given below. The answer is no. He would rather endure anything than live as he once did. That sentence is easy to admire until we hear its sadness. Our whole former life has become unlivable. This does not mean self-help transformation language. Plato is not telling us to outgrow toxic illusions and become our best selves. He is making a harder claim about the price of reorientation. A person can be right to leave and still grieve what leaving changes. They can be grateful for sight and still ache for the world in which they knew how to stand. Imagine returning to a conversation you once found completely satisfying. The jokes land, the references are familiar, the roles are already set. But now you can hear what the conversation depends on. You can hear what it cannot allow itself to ask. You have not become better than the people in the room. You have become unable to enter the room in the old way. Here is a quiet form of exile. Plato's cave intensifies that exile, because the person outside has seen the sun. He has not merely adopted a different opinion, he has encountered the source by which the old opinions must be judged. The gap is not a disagreement within the same field. It is a difference about the field itself. This is why the return will be dangerous. The returned person will not simply say, "I disagree." He will embody the claim that the whole wall is not what the prisoners think it is. The memory and the alienation belong together. Without memory, the philosopher becomes cold. Without alienation, the ascent has not truly happened. Plato holds both. The freed person remembers the cave enough to pity it, but has been changed enough that pity cannot become simple participation. The old world is loved and lost at once. This is why the ascent cannot be the end of the story. If the prisoner were allowed to remain above forever, the cave would become a private tale of escape. But Plato is writing inside the Republic, and the question of justice will not permit private escape to be enough. The person who remembers the cave must face the darker movement, the descent back into it. Memory makes the freed person morally responsible. If he had been born above, the cave might appear only as error from a distance. Because he came from below, he knows the inside of the error. He remembers what made it persuasive. He remembers how the honours felt before they looked hollow. This memory should soften contempt, though it does not undo judgment. The tension between pity and judgment is delicate, because pity can become condescension and judgment can become cruelty. Plato's freed prisoner has to hold both without collapsing into either. He sees that the prisoners are wrong about reality, but he also knows that their wrongness is not a personal failure in the simple sense. It is the condition into which they were formed. That formation is why alienation hurts so sharply. We are not detached minds floating above our histories. The world that shaped us remains in us after we learn to question it. Its phrases come back, its rewards still tug, its fears still sound familiar. The freed person may reject the cave and still carry the cave in memory, habit, and affection. This makes Plato's account of enlightenment emotionally unsentimental. We find no clean rebirth. The person who sees differently is still the person who once belonged below. That continuity matters. It prevents the ascent from becoming fantasy. Philosophy does not erase biography. It reorders it, and reordered biography can ache because the past is neither fully false nor fully inhabitable. We should also hear how lonely it is to know something that cannot yet be shared. The freed person may have seen the sun, but the people below have no place for the meaning of that sentence. If he says too much, he sounds absurd. If he says too little, he betrays what he saw. Alienation lives in that gap between truth and communicability. The next movement will test whether memory can survive return. It is one thing to remember the cave from above. It is another to step back into its darkness, hear its laughter, and still care about the people inside. Plato's Return asks whether philosophy can carry memory without becoming either nostalgia or contempt. Alienation also has a temporal dimension. The freed person is separated not only from other people, but from earlier versions of himself. He remembers wanting what he no longer wants. He remembers fearing what no longer seems ultimate. That memory can feel like betrayal in both directions. Betrayal of the old self by leaving, and betrayal of the new sight by missing what was left. Here is part of why the cave speaks to night viewing so well. At night, the mind often returns to old worlds with a clarity that does not make them simpler. We can see what was wrong, and still feel its pull. We can know a form of life was limited and still grieve its loss. Plato's image belongs to that hour, because it does not rush grief into triumph. The freed prisoner's pity should be heard in that register. It is not pity from a height where the cave has become irrelevant. It is pity from someone who knows how real the cave feels before it is seen as cave. That pity will be tested by return, where memory has to survive mockery. The alienated person also faces a temptation to simplify their own story. It is easier to say the cave was only darkness than to admit it once gave shelter. It is easier to say the people below are merely blind than to remember having loved the same shadows. Plato's memory of the cave resists that simplification. The return will require exactly the sympathy that superiority tries to erase. Alienation also changes speech. The freed person may still use the old words, but the words no longer rest in the same place. Reality, honor, wisdom, success, even education now carry new weight. The others hear familiar sounds. The returned person means something altered by the ascent. Much of the loneliness of seeing clearly lives inside that mismatch of shared vocabulary and divided meaning. If eyes trained for sunlight return to darkness, what does the darkness make of them? Plato's answer is almost cruel. The freed prisoner goes back down, and his eyes are filled with darkness. He cannot see the shadows properly. He stumbles in the very place where he once knew how to look. The cave judges him by cave standards, and by those standards the ascent has made him worse. But this reverses the usual fantasy of return. We imagine someone discovering truth and coming back luminous, articulate, persuasive, ready to teach. Plato gives us a person whose new sight makes him clumsy in the old environment. He has seen more, but he cannot immediately perform more. He knows the shadows are shadows, but he may be less able to compete in naming them. Here is a devastating social fact. And when the prisoners laugh, we should hear the laughter carefully. The issue is not simply wickedness. From where they sit, the evidence is visible. The person who went upward has returned with ruined eyes. He cannot do what ordinary people in the cave can do. If this is what ascent produces, why would anyone want it? The community interprets philosophical transformation as practical impairment. We know versions of this judgment. Someone leaves an old framework and returns unable to speak its language with the same fluency. They question assumptions at the wrong moment, hesitate where others act, and seem less decisive, less loyal, less useful. The group concludes that reflection has weakened them. Sometimes the group is partly right, because new sight can make old action difficult. Plato does not hide that cost. He makes it part of the argument. The person trained for the good may not look impressive inside a world ordered by shadows. If a society measures intelligence by speed in shadow games, then the philosopher's slowness will appear as stupidity. If it measures loyalty by agreement with shared appearances, the philosopher's questions will appear as betrayal. This is where seeing clearly becomes publicly vulnerable. Private pain is one thing, social ridicule is another. A person can endure confusion if the world grants that the confusion belongs to growth. But if the world reads confusion as proof of corruption, the returned person loses authority before speaking. The cave has a defense mechanism built into its standards. It can interpret the effects of ascent as evidence against ascent. So the return is not an epilogue, it is the center of the allegory's trouble. The freed person has to communicate across a broken field of recognition. He has seen what the others have not seen, but the very signs of that seeing make him seem unreliable to them. Plato understands that truth does not automatically carry social credibility. Sometimes it destroys the conditions under which credibility is granted. Here is also why Socrates' fate returns to the edge of the story. Athens did not simply disagree with him as one speaker among others. It judged his questioning as a danger to the city, especially to the young. His practice looked corrupting from within the civic order it disturbed. Whether Plato's memory is fair in every detail is not the point here. The cave gives philosophical form to that experience. The returned questioner appears harmful to those still facing the wall. The darkness after sunlight is not the same as the darkness before ascent. Here is a subtle but important point. The returned person is blind in a new way. Before, he lacked the light. Now he carries too much light for the cave. His incapacity is not ignorance restored. It is the painful mismatch between a transformed soul and an untransformed environment. This mismatch explains why education cannot end with individual enlightenment. If the person who sees cannot return intelligibly, then the community remains untouched. If the community cannot hear the returned person except as damaged, then philosophy fails politically, even if it succeeds privately. Plato's solution will be to compel the philosopher to return and govern. But before we reach that solution, we have to feel why the problem is so hard. We tend to assume that more knowledge makes us more useful to the people around us. Plato shows a case where more knowledge first makes someone less usable by the old world. They no longer flatter its measures. They no longer play its games without hesitation. They may not know how to translate what they have seen. The community may not want the translation, even if they can offer it. So this is where we stand. The ascent ends not in easy triumph, but in alienation. The return reads to the cave as impairment rather than wisdom. The question has widened. Seeing clearly hurts because it makes a person foreign to the world that once made them legible. The next question is darker still. What does a community do when the returned person threatens the reality on which that community depends? The answer is already waiting in Plato's most disturbing line. The prisoners do not merely laugh. They would, if they could, lay hands on and kill the person who tried to release them and lead them upward. At that point, the allegory stops being a story about private education and becomes a story about politics, danger, and the violence of shared appearances defending themselves. The returned prisoner's failure in the dark also challenges our assumptions about expertise. We assume the person who understands more should perform better everywhere. Plato separates understanding from local performance. A person can have a truer grasp of the whole and still be worse at a local game. That distinction is hard for communities to accept because communities often measure truth by visible usefulness. The cave's test is simple. Can you name the shadows well? The returned person's new knowledge does not help with that immediately. It may even interfere because he sees the wall differently now and knows the shadow is not the thing. That knowledge slows him down in a contest that rewards quickness inside the illusion. Wisdom appears incompetent when the test itself belongs to the cave. This has political force. A city may reject philosophy not because philosophy has nothing to offer, but because philosophy does not perform well under the city's existing measures of value. If public life rewards persuasion, speed, reputation, and conformity to shared appearances, then the philosopher's hesitation can look like weakness. Plato is diagnosing a mismatch between truth and civic recognition. The diagnosis should make philosophers modest, because being misunderstood is not automatic evidence of depth. But it should also make communities modest. Shared standards of competence may be too narrow to recognize what would save them. The cave creates a tragic asymmetry. The people most in need of turning may be least able to recognize the signs of someone turned. The laughter in the cave is not a minor emotional detail. It is a social verdict. It tells the returned person, your journey has made you ridiculous. Anyone who follows you will suffer the same damage. The laughter protects the cave by making ascent shameful. Before a community kills the liberator, it may first make the liberator laughable. This is why the descent deepens the pain. Seeing clearly hurts not only because light overwhelms the eyes, but because the return exposes the sighted person to the old world's judgment. The person who has lost fluency must stand before those who still possess it. They have to bear being judged by standards they can no longer fully accept. The descent also tests whether truth can tolerate appearing weak. Many claims to truth depend socially on looking strong, confident, articulate, victorious, immediately useful. Plato's returned prisoner may lack all of that. He comes back with a deeper relation to reality and a worse relation to the cave's performances. This reverses ordinary authority. This reversal helps explain why philosophical speech often sounds awkward in public life. It interrupts, it qualifies. It asks about foundations when the room wants decisions. It can appear evasive because it refuses the terms that make quick answers possible. The cave hears that refusal as incompetence. Sometimes it may be incompetence, sometimes it is the cost of not lying. The returned prisoner's task, then, is not only to know but to learn how to speak again. The ascent trained his eyes for the light. The descent demands another education, how to carry light into darkness without blinding others, flattering them, or abandoning what was seen. Plato does not give that craft enough detail, but the need for it is built into the image. We find a production of shame in this scene that matters. The returned person is not only unable to see well, he is seen being unable to see well. The cave turns his adjustment into public evidence against him. That publicness intensifies the cost of truth. It is one thing to be disoriented alone, it is another to be disoriented before people who take your disorientation as proof that you should never have left. The returned person may also be tempted to perform cave competence to regain acceptance. That temptation is dangerous. To regain fluency by pretending the shadows are final would betray the ascent. But to refuse all fluency would make return impossible. The philosopher has to find a speech that remembers the light without despising the darkness. Now, what kind of community would kill the person who tried to show them what they were missing? If we answer too quickly, we make the prisoners into monsters and lose the argument. Plato's line is extreme, but it is not random. A community organized around shared appearances must treat certain disruptions as threats to the community itself, not merely as alternative opinions. But the freed person does not return saying only that one shadow was misnamed. He returns, implicitly or explicitly, with the claim that the whole system of recognition is misdirected. The honors are misplaced, the expertise is bounded, the wall is not the world. That claim strikes at more than belief. It strikes at status, memory, authority, and the sense that life has been intelligible. And if someone undermines a single opinion, we can debate them. If someone undermines the stage on which our opinions receive their meaning, we may experience them as dangerous before we experience them as interesting. This is one reason the cave remains powerful. It understands that human beings do not protect beliefs only because they think the beliefs are true. We protect them because they hold a world together. So Plato's prisoners have reasons, from inside the cave, to resist the liberator. They can point to his ruined sight, his inability to compete, and the pain he describes. They can say that the journey upward made him worse, and that anyone proposing the same journey for others is a threat. Their conclusion is false in the larger argument, but it is not psychologically absurd. This is where the allegory must not become a persecution fantasy. Plato is not giving every alienated person permission to imagine themselves as the only sighted one among the blind. He is not saying resistance proves truth. Communities can resist false prophets as well as philosophers. The line about killing is not a badge for the misunderstood. It is a warning about the political cost of any truth that breaks a shared world. Socrates makes the warning concrete. He spent years asking Athenians what courage, justice, piety, and wisdom really were. These were not harmless puzzles. They touched the words by which citizens understood themselves. When Socrates showed people that they did not know what they claimed to know, he did not simply embarrass them. He disturbed public confidence in the city's moral language. Plato never forgot that Athens killed him. We should not make the cave only an allegory of Socrates, but we should hear the echo. The line about killing the liberator is written by a man whose teacher had been killed after a life of returning with questions. The cave is philosophical, educational, and political at once because Plato had seen those things become inseparable. The question is what the killing protects: the wall as world and the honors attached to shadow reading. It protects the comfort of not having to re-evaluate a whole life. It protects the community's confidence that its measures are measures of reality. This protection can look like justice from inside. The cave can punish the liberator in the name of preserving order. We are the kind of animal that lives by shared appearances, shared language, shared ceremonies, shared measures of shame and honor. These can be false in some respects and still hold us together. Here is the uncomfortable part. A truth that arrives without care can tear apart a lie, but it can also tear apart the fragile forms through which people have managed to live. Plato knows this, which is why his philosopher cannot simply despise the cave. The danger is real because the community is real. The prisoners are not cardboard obstacles. They are human beings whose world is being threatened. The returned person must speak to people who may be wrong and yet not merely ridiculous. If philosophy forgets that, it becomes another kind of violence. Imagine a group that has spent its whole life mastering a public game. Its awards, offices, memories and jokes all depend on the game being real. Then someone says the game is based on shadows. The first reaction will not be gratitude. It may be anger, and the anger will not be only intellectual. It will defend childhood, labor, friendship and rank. The person who questions the game is questioning the biographies built within it. This is why the cave's violence follows from its social logic. The deeper the shared appearance, the more threatening the disruption. A small correction can be absorbed. A total reorientation cannot be absorbed without changing the community that absorbs it. The community may decide, consciously or not, that it is safer to destroy the person who brings the question than to let the question keep working. This leaves us with a harsher understanding of return. The philosopher is not going back to listeners, waiting for instruction. He is going back to people whose world gives them reasons to reject him. The danger is not an unfortunate accident. It is the natural pressure of truth against a shared order of appearance. Now Plato has to answer why anyone should return at all. The killing line also reveals how fragile a shared world can be. If the cave were completely secure, it would not need to threaten the liberator. Violence appears where the order of appearances senses a danger it cannot answer on its own terms. The liberator's claim cannot be absorbed as one more shadow because it questions the authority of the wall itself. This does not mean every community is secretly murderous. Plato's line works at the level of possibility. It names the end point of a logic. When identity, honor, and reality are bound tightly enough to a shared appearance, the person who breaks that appearance can become intolerable. The cave dramatizes the pressure before it becomes visible in ordinary politics. Socrates' trial shows that pressure in civic form. The charges were legal and religious, not simply psychological. Athens had reasons it could state publicly. Here is part of the tragedy. Communities rarely experience themselves as defending shadows. They experience themselves as defending order, piety, youth, law, and the conditions of common life. The cave helps us see how those defenses can become hostile to philosophy. The line also forces a question about speech. How should the returned person speak to people who may experience the truth as an attack? Too bluntly, and speech becomes violence. Too cautiously, and speech becomes concealment. Plato does not solve that problem in the allegory. He lets it stand as part of the danger of return. We can feel the difficulty in Socratic questioning. Socrates often does not lecture, he asks. Yet even questions can be experienced as assault when they disturb the terms by which people maintain honor. The cave's violence does not require a prophet shouting at the wall. It can be awakened by a question calm enough to reveal that the wall is not what everyone thought. This is one reason philosophy is politically dangerous even when it is not politically partisan. It asks what justice is beneath the city's use of the word. It asks what courage is beneath the songs told about courage. It asks what piety is beneath the inherited rituals of piety. Those questions may be quiet, but they loosen the attachments by which a city recognizes itself. The line about killing also reveals that truth threatens time. The prisoners have invested years in the cave's measures. To accept the liberator's claim would not only change the present, it would reinterpret the past. Their honors, competitions, and memories would have to be seen differently. People often resist truths that require them to reread their lives. That temporal wound helps explain the intensity of the response. The liberator is not only saying that the current wall is misleading, he is implying that the story of who the prisoners have been is incomplete. A community can sometimes accept correction about tomorrow more easily than correction about yesterday. Plato's cave threatens both. Here again, Socrates matters. His questioning often revealed that people had been living with words they could not define. That discovery did not merely embarrass them in the moment, it cast a shadow backward over years of confidence. The anger he provoked belongs partly to that backward reach. Philosophy can make a whole life feel suddenly unexamined. The violence of the cave is also a warning to anyone who thinks truth can enter public life without translation. The returned person may be right and still fail if the speech cannot be heard. Plato's Socrates knows this problem intimately. His questions were precise, but precision did not save him. The city could still interpret philosophical disturbance as moral danger. The cave asks whether any form of speech can cross that gap safely. The most dangerous truths are often not the ones that contradict a detail. They are the ones that make a community ask what its details were for. Plato's liberator threatens that deeper level. He does not merely correct the inventory of the cave, he exposes the cave as cave. That exposure reaches beneath debate into the architecture of common life. If the ascent costs pain, alienation, ridicule, and danger, why would Plato require the philosopher to go back? This is the point where the cave becomes most uncomfortable for modern readers. We might expect the person who has seen the sun to be allowed to remain in contemplation. Plato says no. The city will compel such people to descend again and share in the labor of ruling. But the reason is not merely that philosophers are useful. That would be too shallow. Plato's argument is that the best souls were educated by the city, protected by it, formed through its institutions, and lifted toward the good for the sake of the whole. They do not own their sight as private property. If they have seen what orders justice, then their sight creates an obligation to the community that made the ascent possible. This is where the popular phrase, philosopher king, can mislead. It sounds like a simple hierarchy, the smartest people should rule everyone else. Plato's actual argument is more troubling and more specific. The true philosopher does not want political power. The one who has seen the good would rather remain above. The very person most qualified to rule is the person least hungry for rule. That reluctance is part of the qualification. So the return is not a reward, it is a burden. The philosopher is not sent back because the cave is pleasant or because power is desirable. He is sent back because justice requires that the education of the few serve the order of the whole. Plato's city compels the return because private escape would leave the cave governed by those still measuring reality by shadows. We may resist this, and we should, because the argument raises obvious dangers. Who decides who has seen the good? How can a city distinguish genuine knowledge from arrogance? What prevents compulsion from becoming domination? Plato's own answer depends on an entire educational and political structure that many readers have found deeply troubling. We should not smooth that away. The discomfort is part of the point. But we also need to understand the internal logic. If the good is what makes right judgment possible, and if a city needs right judgment to be just, then those who have seen the good cannot claim innocence by withdrawing. Their knowledge is not ornamental, it bears on the arrangement of common life. To see truly and refuse all return would be, for Plato, a failure of justice. Here is the second compulsion in the cave. The prisoner was compelled out because the cave could not generate the desire for ascent by itself. The philosopher is compelled back because the light cannot remain a private possession. Plato places force at both ends of education, and that should unsettle us. The question is not whether the compulsion is comfortable. It plainly is not. The question is whether Plato can make it just. A small human analogy may help. Sometimes understanding a problem gives us a responsibility we did not ask for. The person who sees a danger in an institution, a family, or a city cannot honestly say that sight has no claim on them. We know the feeling. We want to walk away because speaking will cost too much. But the fact that we see makes silence feel different than it did before. Plato radicalizes that feeling. The philosopher has seen not just a local problem, but the good itself, the source by which public life should be ordered. If that sight is real, then withdrawal becomes morally difficult. The philosopher may prefer the light, but preference is not the measure. Justice is. And justice in Plato's city sends the philosopher back down. Still, the return remains dangerous. The city can compel the philosopher, but it cannot guarantee welcome. The cave can need what it hates. It can require the sight that disrupts it. This is one of the allegory's most painful contradictions. The community may need the returned person precisely because it cannot recognize the returned person's value. We tend to think of knowledge as personal achievement. Plato treats the highest knowledge as a debt. That reversal changes the emotional tone. The person who has escaped does not simply ask what they can now enjoy. They must ask what their sight demands. We can disagree with Plato's politics and still feel the pressure of that question. What do we owe to the world that formed us once we can no longer fully believe in its shadows? The answer cannot be simple service. Returning badly can do harm. The philosopher who comes back with contempt may confirm every fear the cave has. The philosopher who comes back with force alone may reproduce the violence of the turning without the care required for education. Plato's compulsion solves one problem and opens another. How can a soul transformed by the good speak inside a world still organized by appearance? That question moves us toward Plato's own explanation of education. If return is required, then education must be more than telling people what is true. Telling alone will not turn the cave. The next step is to read the passage where Plato names what education is and is not putting sight into blind eyes, but turning the soul that already has sight toward what it must learn to see. The obligation to return also depends on Plato's rejection of private perfection. The philosopher who stays above may preserve personal purity, but the city remains below. For Plato, that is not justice. The soul's ascent is tied to the city's order. The education of the best is justified only if it bends back toward the common life that needs ordering. This makes the philosopher's reluctance important. Plato does not imagine the best rulers as people eager to possess office. Desire for rule reveals attachment to the cave's honors. The person fit to rule would rather contemplate what is. That reluctance creates a paradox. The city must compel the very people who do not want power because their lack of hunger for power is one mark that they may use it justly. We do not have to find that satisfying. The paradox is elegant and dangerous at once. It protects against ambition, but it also authorizes compulsion in the name of a standard most people cannot verify. Plato's city depends on an educational confidence that modern readers have good reasons to question. The tension should remain alive rather than being defended or dismissed too quickly. Still, the debt language remains powerful. Anyone who has been educated by a community inherits obligations they did not individually choose. Teachers, institutions, language, protection, and time made the ascent possible. A person may outgrow the community's appearances and still owe something to the conditions that allowed the outgrowing. Plato gives that ordinary debt a metaphysical intensity. The philosopher's return also changes the meaning of courage. Courage is not only facing physical danger, it is re-entering a field where one's deepest sight may be unintelligible. It is accepting that clarity does not guarantee persuasion. It is serving people who may misread service as corruption. Plato's ruler must have courage of a peculiar kind, the courage to govern without loving the rewards of governing. This is why the good demands return, not because the good is a tyrant, and not because the cave deserves sentimental loyalty, but because knowledge of the good binds the knower to the ordering of what is less good. The higher sight creates lower responsibility. Here is a severe thought, and Plato intends it to be severe. The return also implies that contemplation alone is incomplete for a political animal. Plato gives extraordinary dignity to the vision of the good, but he does not let vision become escape from responsibility. The philosopher must move from seeing to ordering, from contemplation to service, from the purity of the outside to the compromised labor of the cave. That movement is painful because rule requires contact with what the philosopher has outgrown. The ruler must deal with appetites, disputes, honors, fears, and misunderstandings. The cave is not purified before the philosopher enters it. The philosopher enters precisely because it is not purified. Return means carrying a higher measure into a lower field without expecting the lower field to welcome it. This is why Plato's political argument is not merely elitist in the simple sense. It is hierarchical, certainly, but it is also sacrificial. The highest soul is required to descend. The person with the greatest claim to remain above is denied that private satisfaction. The hierarchy burdens its summit. Whether that justifies the hierarchy is another question, but the burden is real in the text. The obligation to return may be the place where Plato's image most clearly refuses modern comfort. We often want knowledge to authorize distance. I have seen through this, so I am free of it. Plato says the opposite. To see through the cave is not to be freed from those inside it. It may be to become more responsible for them, because now their condition is no longer invisible to us. We find also a sadness in the philosopher's reluctance. It is not selfish in any ordinary sense. The philosopher has seen something more worthy than the cave's contests. Wanting to remain with it is understandable. Plato's justice asks the philosopher to sacrifice not a vulgar pleasure, but the highest contemplation. The return is painful because what is being surrendered is genuinely good. After all the images, Plato gives the interpretation. The cave concerns education, but not education in the ordinary sense of delivering information to someone who lacks it. Socrates says education is not what some people claim it is, putting sight into blind eyes. The soul already has the power to learn. The problem is that it is looking in the wrong direction. Here is the conceptual center of the whole allegory. Education is turning, not filling, not decorating or upgrading. Turning. The whole soul must be redirected from the world of becoming toward what is. That phrase can sound technical, but the human meaning is clear. A person may have intelligence, memory, language, and skill, yet still be oriented toward appearances that cannot finally satisfy the mind. The filling model of education is comforting because it leaves the learner basically unchanged. We imagine an empty container receiving content. Add a doctrine, a quotation, a definition, a historical context. The person can then repeat more accurate sentences. Plato thinks that model misses the deepest problem. A soul can repeat true sentences while still loving, fearing, admiring, and seeking in the old direction. Turning is harder because it changes attention and desire. It asks what we look toward when no one forces us. It asks what kind of recognition we crave. It asks which objects command our seriousness. We do not become educated, in Plato's sense, merely by knowing that the shadows are shadows. We become educated by being reoriented toward what is more real than the shadows. This explains why the process hurts. If education were information transfer, pain would be accidental. Perhaps the teacher was unkind, or the lesson poorly designed. But if education is reorientation, pain belongs to the movement. A soul turned away from its familiar objects will feel loss, resistance, and vertigo. The pain is not the goal. It is the cost of changing direction. We measure much of education by what someone can now say. Plato measures by what they can now see and love. Those are not the same. A person can speak beautifully about justice while still desiring only honor. A person can define courage while still fearing the loss of status more than the loss of truth. The cave is designed to expose that difference by asking whether the soul has actually moved. This also clarifies the role of habit. The prisoners are not corrected by one announcement because their bondage is not merely propositional. Their bodies, eyes, pleasures and fears have been trained. Plato's education must address the whole formation, This is why the ascent is long. Dialectic, mathematics, discipline, and political formation all sit behind the image. The cave condenses an entire educational program into one severe picture. The idea can sound authoritarian if stated without care. Turning another person's soul is an enormous claim. It can justify violence if the teacher imagines themselves as owner of the light. Plato is aware enough to make the turning painful and resisted, but not modern enough to remove compulsion from the center. We need to hold both truths. The account has force, and the power it gives educators is dangerous. The safest way to hear the passage is not as permission to coerce, but as a warning against shallow education. If we think education is only information, we will be surprised when facts fail to change people. Plato would not be surprised. Facts meet a soul already ordered by desire, honor, fear, and habit. Unless those are turned, facts are absorbed into the old cave. Imagine two students leaving the same lesson. One has memorized the argument and can reproduce it cleanly. The other has become unable to desire quite the same things in quite the same way. Plato is interested in the second transformation, which may produce fewer polished answers at first, and may even make the student less comfortable. But it means the direction of the soul has begun to shift. So the cave is not anti-ordinary life, but it is anti-complacency. It says that our first orientation is not final. It says that the soul can be capable of sight and still misuse that capacity. It says that education is the art of redirecting a power already present, not manufacturing a power from nothing. That gives human beings dignity and unease at the same time. So this is where we stand. Education, for Plato, is the turning of a soul that was already capable of sight toward what it had been pointed away from. That explains the compulsion, the pain, the dazzlement, the alienation, and the danger of return. The question that remains is what justifies a demand that costs this much, and who has the right to make it? The answer will not be gentle. Plato's argument produces a double compulsion. The prisoner is compelled out because the cave cannot understand the value of leaving before leaving begins. The philosopher is compelled back because sight of the good is not a private escape. The same theory of education that explains the pain of ascent also explains the burden of return. This passage on education is easy to quote and hard to absorb. Many people agree that education should be more than memorization. Plato is saying something stronger. He is not merely praising deep learning over shallow learning. He is claiming that the soul's existing power is misdirected, and that a real education changes the object of the soul's love. That word love may seem too warm, but it belongs near Plato. We do not attend only with intellect. We attend with desire. We look where we have learned to expect value. A soul pointed at honor will find honor luminous. A soul pointed at appetite will find appetite urgent. A soul pointed at truth will slowly learn to see by another light. Education changes what shines. This is why the cave cannot be solved by announcing conclusions. The prisoners could be told that the shadows are shadows, but the wall would still command their attention. They could repeat a doctrine about the sun without wanting the painful road toward it. Plato's education must redirect the love of the soul, not simply correct the propositions in its speech. The modern temptation is to reduce this to critical thinking. Critical thinking matters, but Plato's picture is more demanding. A clever person can criticize everything while remaining fixed on the same objects of desire. The soul may become sharper without becoming turned. For Plato, intelligence is not enough. Intelligence in service of shadows may only make the cave more sophisticated. Here is a frightening thought for any intellectual culture. We can build elaborate systems of analysis inside the cave. We can become subtle about shadows. We can produce distinctions, careers, arguments, and reputations without ever turning toward the good. Plato's cave is not anti-intellectual. It is a warning that intellect without reorientation can become another cave skill. So the educational question becomes one of direction. What are we being trained to notice? What are we being trained to admire? And what forms of success make us feel real? Those questions are uncomfortable because they reach beneath curriculum into formation. They ask not only what has been taught, but what kind of soul the teaching has produced. This account of education also changes the role of the teacher. A teacher is not merely a supplier of content, nor is the teacher a magician who creates sight from nothing. The teacher attends to direction. They arrange encounters, disciplines, and questions that help the soul turn. The result is a subtler and more dangerous vocation because it works on what the learner loves. The danger is manipulation. Any practice that shapes desire can become domination. Plato's own confidence in philosophical education raises this risk. But the risk does not disappear if we deny it. Every culture educates desire somehow. The question is not whether souls will be turned, but toward what, by whom, and under what standard. This is one of the reasons the cave remains so useful. It makes education visible as formation. We can ask not only what a school teaches, but what it trains students to admire, not only what a society permits, but what it rewards, not only what a person says they believe, but what they keep turning toward when pressure comes. The turning of the soul also explains why philosophy is slower than opinion. Opinion can change quickly because it may not touch direction. A person can exchange one claim for another while remaining attached to the same honors and fears. Philosophy, in Plato's sense, asks whether those attachments have been reordered. That is slower work. It cannot be rushed without becoming another performance inside the cave. This also explains why the cave resists quick pedagogical optimism. If the soul's direction is formed over years, then one argument rarely turns it completely. A true sentence may begin the work, but formation answers to repetition, discipline, and desire. Plato's educational imagination is long because the cave's education was long first. We have now reached the hard symmetry of the allegory. The prisoner is compelled out of the cave. The philosopher is compelled back into it. The first compulsion wounds the person who does not yet understand why they are being turned. The second compulsion burdens the person who understands too much to want the cave again. Both movements belong to Plato. Neither is comfortable. And this is why the double movement matters so much. If truth only pulled the prisoner upward, the cave would be a story about escape. If justice only sent the philosopher downward, it would be a story about sacrifice. Plato binds the two together. We are made to see that clarity without return can become private possession, while return without clarity becomes mere loyalty to the old wall. The pain sits between those failures. It belongs to a person who can no longer belong innocently below, but who is also not permitted to keep the higher sight as private shelter. Here is a harder demand than either simple liberation or simple duty. It asks whether seeing well creates obligations we would never have chosen from inside the cave. This double compulsion is not a loose inconsistency. It follows from the same claim about the good. If the good is what makes knowledge and justice possible, the soul must be turned toward it even when the soul resists. And if a soul has seen it, that soul cannot treat the sight as private luxury while the city remains below. The good pulls upward and sends back downward. The popular picture of Plato's politics often stops at rule by the wise. That picture is too thin. Plato's philosopher does not rule because ruling is attractive. The philosopher rules because the city requires someone who is not intoxicated by the cave's honors. The best ruler is reluctant because desire for power is itself a sign of cave orientation. This is one of Plato's deepest political suspicions. But reluctance does not remove coercion because the philosopher must be forced. Plato has Socrates say that the city will compel the philosophers to take their turn in the cave. The word matters. The person who has seen the sun is not asked whether dissent sounds fulfilling. The city claims them. The education that freed them also binds them. We should not pretend this is easy to accept. Modern readers are right to worry about anyone claiming authority from a higher vision. History gives us too many examples of people forcing others in the name of some alleged good. Plato's argument depends on a real good and on a long formation capable of distinguishing knowledge from appetite. If those conditions fail, the politics can become frightening very quickly. Yet the alternative has its own problem. If no one who sees more clearly returns, the cave remains governed by those best adapted to shadows. Honor goes to the cleverest shadow readers, Power goes to those who know how to move within appearances. The city may become efficient, persuasive, even stable, while still being ordered away from what is good. Plato thinks that is intolerable. This is why Socrates now returns with full weight. He was not a ruler in Plato's city, but he was a man who kept going back. He returned to conversations, workshops, gymnasia, public spaces, and private certainties. He questioned people who had not asked to be turned. His life reveals the cost of philosophical return in a city that experiences the turning as corruption. Plato writes The Cave roughly a generation after that death. The allegory is not revenge, it is a philosophical reckoning. What if the city killed the man who was trying, however painfully, to turn it? What if the hostility to philosophy was not accidental, but built into the relation between cave and light? What if Socrates' fate was not an exception, but the danger Plato's image had to explain? The double compulsion gives one answer. The philosopher cannot remain above because the city needs sight. The philosopher may be endangered below because the city resists being turned. Justice demands return while appearance punishes return, and that is the tragic structure, not tragedy in the theatrical sense, but a conflict between goods that cannot be made painless. We tend to think truth resolves obligations, but Plato shows truth creating them. Once we see differently, neutrality becomes harder for us. Silence changes meaning, withdrawal changes meaning, speech changes meaning too. Every option carries cost. The person who sees may be tempted to despise the cave, abandon it, dominate it, or serve it badly. Plato's challenge is to imagine a return that is neither cowardice nor contempt. This is where the pain of seeing becomes moral, rather than merely intellectual. Suffering because old beliefs collapse is one thing. Discovering that the collapse makes a claim on how we live with others. The freed person does not just ask, "What do I now know?" They ask, "What do I owe because I know it?" Here is a much harder question. The answer Plato offers is justice. But justice here is not soft. It forces the philosopher against preference. It forces the city to depend on people it may not understand. It forces education to be more than private cultivation. We can dispute the answer while still seeing the force of the problem. The cave asks whether truth can remain innocent once it becomes responsible for others. By this point, Socrates is no longer only the man who stood before the Athenian jury. He is the historical pressure behind the allegory's return. A man goes back to the cave of Athens with questions. The city reads the questions as danger. The man dies. Plato spends the rest of his philosophical life asking what kind of education, city, and soul could make that death intelligible without making it acceptable. The symmetry also reveals why the cave cannot be reduced to freedom from illusion. Freedom alone would permit the philosopher to remain above. Plato's justice does not. The ascent frees the soul from one bondage and binds it to another obligation. That second binding is not a regression, it is the political meaning of having seen the good. This is where the word compulsion changes tone. At the start, compulsion belongs to the teacher who turns the prisoner. At the end, compulsion belongs to the city that sends the philosopher back. The same word gathers two different pains. The pain of someone who does not yet understand the ascent, and the pain of someone who understands too well what descent will cost. Socrates stands between those pains. He turned others through questioning, often against their comfort. He also returned continually to a city that would finally condemn him. Plato's memory of him carries both sides of the allegory. Socrates is not simply the liberated man above the cave. He is also the one who goes back, speaks inside the city, and pays for the disturbance. The double compulsion also prevents the philosopher from becoming a private hero. Many modern versions of the cave end with the individual awakened. Plato's version asks what that awakening owes. The difference is enormous. Private awakening can become narcissistic. Platonic ascent, however troubling, is forced to answer to justice. It must ask how the sighted person lives with those who do not see. This is why the cave remains a political image even when it speaks to private experience. The soul's turning and the city's order mirror each other. A disordered soul loves shadows. A disordered city honors shadow readers. A turned soul sees by another measure. A just city would somehow have to give that measure political form. Plato's solution is controversial, but the mirroring is central to the argument. So the double compulsion leaves no innocent place to stand. Staying below is bondage, being dragged upward is painful, remaining above is unjust, returning below is dangerous. Plato has built an image in which every movement costs something. This is why it is still alive. It refuses the fantasy that truth will ask nothing of us except agreement. The double compulsion is also a test of whether Plato's philosophy can remain humane. A system that drags people upward and sends philosophers downward can become brutal if it forgets the pain it imposes. The memory of pain should discipline the return. Anyone who has been turned should know that turning hurts. That knowledge ought to make the philosopher patient, not proud. Socrates' patience was not always experienced as gentleness, but it was a form of return through dialogue rather than decree. He asked, waited, exposed contradictions, and often left people unsettled rather than converted. Plato's political imagination later becomes more architectonic, but the Socratic shadow keeps another possibility alive: return as questioning rather than domination. The tragedy is that even questioning can be too much for the cave. A gentle turn may still be felt as force if the soul is deeply attached to the wall. That means there may be no perfectly innocent method. Philosophy risks harm by speaking and betrayal by silence. The double compulsion names that impossible pressure. This is why the double compulsion feels tragic rather than merely strict. Each movement answers a real failure and creates a real wound. The outward drag answers the soul's captivity to appearance. The downward command answers the temptation to private escape. Neither answer is gentle. Together they show a philosophy that refuses both comfort and abandonment. Plato gives us responsibility without innocence. This is why Socrates can be both model and problem. He embodies return, but his fate shows that return may fail catastrophically. Plato does not forget either side. He honors the philosophical life, and he tries to imagine a city in which that life would not simply be destroyed. The cave is one bridge between grief over Socrates and the political architecture of the Republic. We have followed the prisoner from shadows to firelight, from firelight to pain, from pain to ascent, from ascent to the sun, and from the sun back into darkness. What has Plato actually shown us? Not that truth is pleasant, not that the enlightened person is automatically noble, and not that the people below are stupid. The answer is more exact and less comforting. Seeing clearly is painful, because it changes the relation between a person and their world. The prisoner does not simply acquire a correct belief. He loses the old conditions of recognition. The things that once counted as real now appear derivative. The honors that once mattered now appear misdirected. The community that once made him legible now may read him as damaged. The pain is not a side effect. It belongs to the structure of the movement. Plato also shows that pain does not prove truth. Here is the essential caution. Many painful experiences do not educate. Many alienated people are not philosophers. Many communities resist because the alleged liberator is wrong, cruel, or vain. The cave is not a license for self-certainty. It is an account of what genuine reorientation may cost when the movement is actually toward what is more real. That caution protects the whole argument. Without it, the cave becomes a slogan of awakening. Plato's text is harder. The freed person must be trained, not merely shocked. They must learn to see gradually. They must return without contempt. They must submit even their new sight to the good, not to the pleasures of feeling superior. Philosophy cannot escape discipline by calling itself light. What the allegory resolves is the central question. Why does Plato make seeing clearly hurt? Because education is the turning of the whole soul, not the delivery of information. Because the cave is a world, not a simple prison. Because the light first overwhelms eyes trained for shadow. Because the return makes the sighted person strange to the people among whom they must still live. What the allegory does not resolve is just as important. Who has the right to compel the turning? How can we know that the person claiming to have seen the good has not merely found another shadow? What does the philosopher owe to those below, and what do they owe to the philosopher? Plato's answer is powerful, but it is not clean. The double compulsion remains morally dangerous even when it is philosophically coherent. This is why the cave still matters beyond its fame. A famous image can become harmless through repetition. We learn the parts, repeat the meaning and move on. But when read slowly, the cave refuses to become harmless. It asks what happens when truth damages belonging. It asks whether education can be justified when the educated person experiences the beginning as violence. It asks whether return is duty, arrogance, love, or all three in tension. Socrates remains the human test. If the cave were only a metaphysical diagram, his death would be background, but the passage about killing the liberator draws the history close. Plato saw a city destroy a man who asked it to examine itself. The cave is one way of asking what that destruction meant. Was Socrates simply unlucky, or did philosophy touch something every cave must defend? The answer cannot be reduced to Athens alone. Any shared world can punish the person who reveals its shadows, but any shared world also has reasons to fear false liberators. That double truth keeps the answer from becoming easy. We cannot simply side with the one who claims light. We cannot simply side with the comfort of the cave. We have to ask what kind of turning is justified, what kind of return is responsible, and what kind of speech can bear the cost of both. So philosophy cannot undo the pain by explaining it. Explanation may make the wound intelligible, but it does not restore the old home. Once the cave is seen as a cave, it cannot be unseen in the old way. The person may still love the people below. They may still remember the games, the jokes, the honors, the familiar names, but memory is not return. It is the ache that makes return possible without contempt. Plato has made the cave disturbing again. The pain is not decoration. The blindness is not a mistake. The alienation is not a melodramatic flourish. The danger is not an afterthought. They all follow from the claim that education turns a soul toward what is more real than the world that first taught it how to see. And yet, the last question remains open. If philosophy turns us away from the shadows that formed us, does it free us from the people still facing them, or bind us to them more deeply? Plato's answer is return. Our unease with that answer is part of the inheritance. The cave gives us enough light to see the problem. It does not give us a painless way to live with it. And that brings us back to the image Plato refuses to soften. A person walking back into darkness with eyes that remember the sun, carrying a truth that may not be welcomed by the world that made them. Not a summary and not advice, but a return. This also corrects the emotional tone because we are not being asked to admire pain. We are being asked to understand why a certain kind of clarity cannot avoid it. That distinction is vital because pain can deceive as easily as comfort can. Plato's cave does not sanctify suffering. It explains why the reorientation of a whole soul, if it is real, will disturb the world that trained the soul otherwise. The answer also preserves the humanity of the prisoners. They are wrong about the shadows, but they are not outside concern. The philosopher's return only makes sense if the people below still matter. This is why the cave is not a story of escape from inferior people. It is a story about responsibility to a shared condition. We came from the cave, we remember it, we may still love people in it. The unresolved questions remain, because Plato's solution is not simply ours. Many of us cannot accept the political confidence of the Republic. We may doubt that anyone has seen the good in a way that authorizes rule. We may fear the violence hidden in claims of higher knowledge. Those doubts are serious, but they do not erase the problem Plato saw. Communities can be ordered by appearances, and those most adapted to appearances may be least able to lead beyond them. This is why a mature reading of the cave has to hold unease on both sides. We should fear the cave's resistance to truth. We should also fear the liberator who loves compulsion too easily. We should fear a city that kills Socrates. We should also fear any would-be philosopher who has forgotten what it felt like to be chained. Plato gives us no permission to stop fearing prematurely. What philosophy cannot undo is the history of having belonged. The turned soul does not become abstract. It carries old loves in changed form. It carries old language while trying to speak beyond it. It carries a memory of shadow that may be necessary for mercy. The wound of seeing clearly is also the source of any humane return. So the movement is not triumph, but responsibility under uncertainty. The cave has answered why clarity hurts, but it has not answered every question clarity creates. That is fitting. A philosophy that pretended to remove all difficulty would betray the very image it is interpreting. Plato leaves the problem alive because the relation between truth and belonging is still alive. This unease is why the cave should leave us with a question rather than a lesson. A lesson would make the image safe again. It would tell us what to do with truth, how to educate others, how to return without risk. Plato gives guidance inside the Republic, but the image itself keeps the wound open. It asks us to carry an unresolved responsibility. The strongest answer here is not certainty but clarification. We now know why the pain is structural, why the cave is socially powerful, and why the good matters. We know why return is dangerous and obligatory inside Plato's argument. But knowing the structure does not remove the burden of judgment in any particular life or city. That burden is where the cave still speaks. Whenever we see something that others do not see or think we do, the allegory asks whether we have earned the claim, whether we remember the cave, whether we can return without contempt, and whether the truth we carry is actually light or only another shadow brightened by pride. The cave should now feel heavy, not obscure. We can say what the pain is doing in the image. It marks the cost of losing a world, the difficulty of acquiring a truer measure, and the danger of returning to people whose reality is still organized around the old one. That is enough to answer why seeing clearly hurts. It is not enough to remove the burden that the answer creates. That burden matters because the cave is not only behind us, it is also in the forms of confidence that still feel ordinary. We inherit measures, use them, defend them, and only sometimes notice that they have been teaching us what counts as visible. Plato's image asks for a slower honesty, not the pride of being outside every cave, but the discipline of asking which walls we have not yet learned to see as walls. So the final pressure is ethical. If we claim to have seen more clearly, the cave asks what that claim has made us responsible for, not whether we can win an argument, not whether we can despise the wall, whether we can return with enough truth to remain honest, and enough memory to remain human. That is the difficulty Plato leaves behind. This is why the question is not whether we are inside or outside the cave once and for all. It is how honestly we can examine the forms of sight we have inherited, and how responsibly we can live when one of them breaks. Plato gives us an image of awakening, but its deepest demand is care after awakening. The cave should not leave us eager to appoint ourselves as liberators. It should leave us slower, more exact, and more aware of the cost any real turning imposes. If we speak of light, Plato asks whether we have also understood the eyes that hurt, the memory of the wall, and the danger of returning to people who did not ask us to disturb their world. This is why the image still deserves patience. It does not ask us to celebrate escape. It asks us to understand that the discipline, danger, and mercy required after escape has made ordinary belonging impossible. The hard part is not leaving once. The hard part is returning without lying about what was seen. That remains the question. The last care is humility. The cave does not make us owners of light. It makes us answerable for how we speak after light has changed us, and for whether we can remember the darkness without returning to it as home. The person who returns must carry two memories at once, the memory of sunlight and the memory of having once mistaken shadows for the whole. Without the first, return becomes surrender. Without the second, return becomes cruelty. Plato leaves philosophy in the difficult space between them, where truth has to remain truthful and still remember the human beings for whom the cave was once the only world. The difficulty is that no one can live permanently at the level of an image. Sooner or later, the question becomes conduct. How we speak, how we teach, how we return, and how we refuse the comfort of both domination and withdrawal when the cave is still full of people we recognize. Here is the burden of seeing, and it remains ours. The question survives because the return is never merely theoretical, it is lived among others. Now the cave does not end with the prisoner standing free in the light. This is where the clean version wants to stop, because the clean version wants truth without return. Plato does not stop there. He sends the person back down, eyes full of darkness again, carrying something the others cannot yet see and may not want to hear. This is the final wound in the image. The person who has seen differently cannot simply become who they were before. The old wall is still there. The old voices still echo. The old honors still circulate among the people below. But the relation has changed. What once felt like the whole world now appears as a world held together by shadows. We came asking why seeing clearly is painful. Plato's answer is that sight is never only visual. It is a way of belonging to reality, and when that way changes, belonging changes with it. But Socrates gives the answer a human face. Plato wrote The Cave after watching his teacher return again and again to citizens who did not want the disturbance he brought. Socrates did not flatter the cave. He asked questions that made inherited confidence unstable, and Athens answered with a death sentence. The allegory is not only a timeless fable about illusion, it is also a way of thinking about what happened when philosophy walked back into the city. And still, Plato does not let the philosopher remain above. That may be the most troubling part. The person who has seen the good has already paid in pain, disorientation, and exile. To send that person back is to ask for more, ridicule, failure, perhaps death. But for Plato, sight of the good is not private property. If the city made the ascent possible, and if the city still lives among shadows, then knowledge becomes a debt, and we do not have to make that answer smooth. The double compulsion remains dangerous. The prisoner is compelled out. The philosopher is compelled back. Both movements can look violent from one angle and necessary from another. Plato wants us to feel that tension. If the soul must be turned, who may turn it? If the philosopher must return, who may demand that return? If the cave is a shared world, what happens when someone breaks the terms by which that world recognizes itself? So the cave gives those questions a shape, not a painless solution. It shows why truth can hurt before it helps, why education can feel like damage before it becomes understanding, and why returning to people who do not see what we see may be the hardest part of seeing at all. It leaves us with the knowledge that clarity is not simply the removal of an illusion. Sometimes it is the loss of a home. The next question follows naturally. If the cave is not just a place, but a structure of human seeing, then we have to ask how we would ever know when we are inside one. Hume will press that through experience. Kant will press it through the forms our minds bring to what appears. The old problem returns in another shape. Whether stepping into the light means leaving the cave, or only entering a larger one. For tonight, Plato leaves us between the wall and the sun. A person turns toward the light and is hurt by it. A person sees what they could not see before, and becomes less at home among the people who still face the shadows. A person returns anyway, carrying a truth that may not be welcomed, and may not even be speakable in the old language. If seeing clearly costs that much, what do we owe to the world that taught us how to see before we knew we were seeing shadows?